Welcome to the Terrain and Site Planning Learning the Basics seminar. In this session, I'll cover the tips for terrain and site plan, the process of creating a terrain, importing a terrain image or map, adding elevation data, creating a site plan, and finally, adding some landscape items. If you would like to follow along with this session, I will be using the Bachelor View sample plan that you can download from our webpage, chiefarchitect.com/samples. Let's begin with the tips and best practices for creating a terrain, site plan, and landscape plan. As you get ready to create a terrain or site plan, be sure your Save Plan view is set in a mode such as Plot Plan that is found in the program's main template. For this seminar, I'm going to be using a custom terrain modifiers for the Save Plan view. I also have a site plan and a landscape plan. You can see these on your screen. These are available in the sample plan. The program does ship with a basic one called Plot Plan, but if you want to take advantage of these, you can easily use these from the sample project we're working on. The next tip is to make sure that you use the terrain toolbar configuration. Currently my toolbar configuration is set up to have all of the terrain tools displayed. You can easily toggle that. My configurations are found in the upper menu system. This is the default, which is using the typical home building tools, walls, doors, windows, and then when I switch it over to the terrain configuration, the second tier of tools changes so that it's easy to access all of the typical tools you might be using for terrain and site plans. Next, you want to go through the process of creating a north pointer, otherwise the program will default it as directly straight up, and if you want shadow and line bearing accuracy, a north pointer will be helpful. You'll find this tool underneath the CAD menu for north pointer. There is also sun angle information you can put in there. I typically will create 4 different sun angles, one for the shortest day at morning and evening, and then another set for the longest day, again morning and evening. You can create as many as you want. That way when you're creating your 3D views or looking at shadow information, that sun angle can be a helpful process depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Next is to set the CAD default to be in decimal feet and quadrant bearing. Quadrant bearing will allow you, probably difficult to see, to get the quadrant information along with the length of the lot line. You can set this default underneath your default settings, underneath CAD, and then General CAD, and the option for the display line angle. Here are your options, and I typically will use the quadrant bearing so that I can get that detail onto my site plan. When you are creating your terrain perimeter, you may have a multi-story house, one with a basement, main story, or a 2-story. You can only have one terrain perimeter in your model, and you can draw that on any floor that you want. I typically prefer to draw it on the most relevant floor. That would be the floor I would walk out on for the terrain. A couple of options for this project in our sample plan, the bachelor view, you're looking at the bottom of the house. Down here, the walkout basement, I chose to put the terrain on floor 0 in that case. It could have easily been done on floor 1. It's up to you. Just choose the floor that is the most relevant, and remember you can only have one terrain perimeter. Next is to draw the terrain perimeter larger than your lot. Things that are on the terrain perimeter, like your roads, will only show up if they are on the terrain perimeter. Let's zoom out and slide over a little bit so we can see the situation for this particular terrain. Let me change the view from the terrain perimeter to the site plan. The actual lot that I use is much smaller than where the road is. If I want the road and the cul-de-sac to be visible in 3D, then I want to have the terrain perimeter go out beyond that. That way I will create the terrain perimeter much larger than the actual lot itself. I'm going to cover the process of how I do that in this session. Let me switch back into the terrain modifiers save plan view. The next note I have is the terrain is relative to a zero height. When you create your initial terrain perimeter, it's going to come in at a zero height. If you're using sea level, then we'll use absolute elevations. It's best to do that at the time you create it. I am going to cover that here in the session, so we'll talk about that. I see this comment quite a bit. Sometimes you want to figure out if you want to draw the terrain first or the house first. It doesn't matter per se. I usually will draw the house first and then import the terrain with it and figure out where it gets positioned. And then if I need to move the terrain around, I will move the terrain and not the house. So again, I always move the terrain and not the house. You need to make sure that those layers are isolated so you can do the movement if you're trying to position exactly from a lot line. In the session, I'm going to show you how to take a copy of the terrain you may get from a accessor database or maybe a satellite image or a map image and import that. You can also import data from a surveyor. That's a specific data. Surveyors typically may put out a DWG style file. We have a great video on how that works. It's video 1056 if you wanted to see importing terrain. And then the less accurate option is to trace from an image. Again, I'm going to cover that in this session. And then when it gets down to putting elevation data into your site plan, there are points, lines, and elevation regions. I try to always avoid using points. They're very granular. I typically will try to use elevation regions, and if I can't do that, I will then use an elevation line. It's an easier process to work with elevation regions. And remember, it does take a minimum of 2 elevation lines to create a slope on a terrain. So if you've created a terrain and you draw one line, it has no effect. You need to draw another line or elevation region to get the terrain to slope. Let's get started with creating our terrain. Let's zoom out and slide over to where our house is located. I've already drawn in the roads and you can see the floor plan of the basement or the daylight basement level. One of the first things that I do for a site plan is I like to make sure that the roof and the overhang is on. With my reference display, I can toggle that on and you can see the roof. And if you're curious about reference display, you can tap on the floor indicator, come down here, and you can see that I've created a reference display for the roof overlay. Click the Define button. And using this layer set called Reference Roof Display, I only have the roof planes and the walls that form the deck turned on with a lighter gray style color. To create a terrain perimeter, you'll find this in your menu, and you can only create one terrain perimeter per plan. When you create the terrain perimeter, it's going to try to fill the space for your plan. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller and pull it in just in that area. Now the terrain perimeter is much larger than the lot. If we zoom in, this is a picture of the image of the lot. And if you look at this image, the lot itself boundary is much smaller than the road, but by creating the terrain perimeter to encapsulate the road, when you take your 3D overview, you'll be able to see that road. Now the basic flat perimeter comes in, and there is zero contour to these perimeters. They come in at a relative zero to the terrain and the house itself. Let's go through and begin looking at making some modifications to the terrain. And as we kind of zoom into the front of the house, the first thing is I want to raise the terrain up with respect to the house. So what I'm going to do is double click on the terrain. Underneath the general panel, I'm going to come down for the building pad and I'm going to remove the automatic check mark. You can see that the terrain subfloor height is just over 22 inches. I'm going to reduce that to 8¼ inches so that the subfloor is above the terrain by 8¼ inches. So you can see how that jumps up, and now as we rotate around the back, remember this has a daylight basement. If we peek underneath, you can see that we're going to have to slope this terrain down around this area, And if you look at the floor plan view in that image, this is a picture that we had from the assessor's database, and it shows the contour of the lot. And this lot is basically sloping from front to rear about 12 feet. The front of the lot is at sea level 3820, and at the rear of the lot it slopes down to 3808. Let's take a look at the process of how you might slope this lot. And I might make this just a little bit smaller. I put some CAD points in here to help me in drawing this quickly. Here's what I'm going to do to create this lot shape. This is an image that I have down here. I'm just going to make a copy of that, and I'm going to slide a copy of it over so we can see it right in this area right in here. And if we zoom in just a little bit, you'll notice that this lot is 182 feet along this bottom line boundary. I'm going to use the point-to-point resize tool, click on the image, and I'm going to come down into the menu in the bottom, and I'm going to use this point-to-point resize. I'm going to click, and I'm going to click on this point. I'm going to drag over to the other point. When the dialog opens, I'm going to type in 182 feet to scale this image based on that lot line. Now I'll go ahead and zoom out, and I'm going to take this image and I'm going to superimpose it over the lot itself. The tool that I use to do that would be the point-to-point move. I'm going to use this point-to-point move. I'm going to click in this area right here, and we'll come up and try to snap right on that corner right in there. That should be very close. Now tracing over the lot, I'm going to use the line tool. I'm going to begin up at the top up here, and I'm going to come in, and as I'm dragging this line out, as I'm still dragging it out, I'm going to press the tab key. And we know that this line in particular for the top boundary is 163 feet. And if I use a negative number, since I'm dragging it from the right to the left, that will be exactly 163 feet with that line. We'll snap onto the top of that, come down. This line, as I'm dragging it out, again press the tab key, is 100, and again I'm moving from the top to the bottom, minus 158 feet. And then we'll come over here. This line is 182 feet. We'll go ahead and press the tab key, and we'll enter in 182 feet. And then for this line, we'll go ahead and click and drag up. Again, I'm pressing the tab key as I do this. This number should be 56 feet 11.2 inches. And then for the last line segment, here's what I'm going to do. Let's zoom in just a little bit further. I'm going to come down. I'm not going to worry about pressing the tab key. That's 6 feet or so. Draw a line segment there. I'm going to draw one more line segment in here. So I have 2 line segments, and then the last one I'm going to come over and snap that on. Let's go ahead and begin by curving that. I'm going to click on the line segment. I'm going to use the convert to arc tool, grab this diamond, and I'm just going to pull it in right around that area around the road. We'll do the same thing up here. Go ahead and curve this segment, and we should be very close to getting that in that area right in there. So using the trace tool, I was able to use the image and just trace over it with the line. Now the next step I'm going to do is click on this closed polyline, and this is going to represent the actual lot itself. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to change the layer that it's on by going to the line style. It comes in the default called CAD plot line. I'm going to click the define button, and I have a specific layer for my terrain. You come down, and I've created one called the terrain perimeter lot. I'm going to set that on there, and now I've assigned that layer. I also have a different color for it, and now I've created that lot, and then I can simply delete the image that we used previously. I'm just going to press the delete key. I have an extra copy of it down here that I need. This will represent the lot boundary. For the setback on the lot, it's required to be 15 feet on all sides of the lot. I'm going to make a copy of the main lot, and I'm going to resize that to be 15 feet inside. To do that, let's go into our preferences and come down to the CAD edit behaviors, and I'm going to set the concentric jump to be that value of 15 feet. With that loaded in, I'm going to click on the lot itself. I'm going to choose the copy button in the lower section of the menu, and then I'm going to use the copy, paste, hold position, create a copy of that. I'm going to come up, I'm going to hold the letter C down on my keyboard and then left click and drag. I'm going to go ahead and double click to open it up. I'm going to change the layer from the terrain perimeter lot, and I should have a setback layer that I've already created. It has a different line style, and use that as the setback for the lot. Now if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that I need to do a little bit of cleanup in this area. So I'm just going to use these edit handles, pull these down, snap them approximately into place. I'm not going to worry about being too exact, and that should be pretty close to having the setback that's 15 feet on each side of the lot. Next, I want to display the length of the lot boundary and then create the north pointer. First, to display the lot line dimensions, I'm going to double click and open up the lot perimeter. On the line style, I'm going to come down and I'm going to turn on show length and show angle. Next, I'm going to create a north pointer. You can see the image that we traced over has the north pointer in it. You'll find the north pointer underneath the CAD tools. I'm going to come down here and click and drag the north pointer. Notice that the information changed on the angles. And as you rotate the north pointer around, these angles will then update accordingly. So I'm just going to make this parallel, and you might eyeball it. I'm going to slide it over the top of the north pointer. That's pretty much parallel. That looks good. And I'll just slide it off to the side. If you want to be exact with your bearing information, be sure to draw your north pointer. Otherwise, the program will assume that it is straight up and down. We currently have the setback, the lot, and the terrain perimeter. In fact, I'm going to make this terrain perimeter a little bit smaller in this area. Let's take a look at the process to slope the terrain. Using our full camera overview tool, let's take a look at what we have in 3D. You can see the terrain is flat front to back, and the first step that we're going to do is we're going to slope this from the road down about 12 feet. The easiest way to slope your terrain is to use the terrain line tool. As I began the video, I try to discourage using terrain points or elevation points. They can get detailed and can be complex to work with. You might think about using the elevation line and elevation splines. I prefer to use the elevation regions. I'm going to begin by just using an elevation line. When you click and drag this line, be sure to go through the entire terrain perimeter. See the boundary of this? My line extends past that. The next thing I'm going to do is draw another line to the bottom of the terrain. The first one that I would have drawn would have come in at 0 feet relative to the terrain. This one also would have come in at 0 feet, and I'm going to open it up and I'm going to change it to be minus 12 feet so that it slopes the terrain. When you're in a 2D view and you don't see the contours update, sometimes you have to force the terrain to be rebuilt. It will be rebuilt automatically when you go into 3D. Let's go ahead and go into the 3D view and take a look at what we have. So you can see that it's sloping the terrain, and some of the things that's causing the terrain not to be a nice smooth slope are the roads and the terrain wall that we have drawn in the program. All of those things can cause the terrain to be a little bit different than expected. If there were no objects in here and it was just a flat terrain, you'd see a nice slope that would gradually go down to the bottom at 12 feet. Now let's go back and I'm going to show you my preferred approach in creating these things. I'm going to press undo a couple of times here. I prefer to use the terrain tool called the elevation region. Using this tool, you can control the terrain in a more accurate and easier manner, in my opinion. First terrain region should come in at relative 0. I'm going to draw one more in the back of the terrain. And again, I want this to do a similar slope of about minus 12 feet. Now to be exact, here's what I'm going to do to figure out what this lower terrain region is. I'm going to click on one of the rooms in the bottom and open it up, and I'm going to figure out what the elevation is for this structure. On the structure panel, if I come down and I look at what the floor is, it says it's at minus 135 7/8. You can see it in the diagram. For the walkout patio, I'm going to make it slightly below the minus 135. I'll just round it up and use minus 136 on that lower elevation region. That should create a nice flat patio area as you walk out the daylight basement. Double click on this. I'm going to open it and I'm going to put in minus 136 in inches. Let's regenerate the terrain and take a look at what this looks like in the 2D view, and then we move back over into the 3D view and you can see the change in 3D. It's maybe not much better, but you can begin to see the slope. And I'm going to go back in and modify those terrain regions so it kind of goes around the house and we can create a nice easy slope. Back over into the floor plan view. Let's zoom in a little bit. And to make this an easier process, I did put some subtle CAD points in here that I'm going to snap to. You might see this first grouping, I'm using orange CAD points. I'm going to create a break using the break tool. You'll notice that there's a shortcut for break, number 3 on the keyboard. I'm going to put a break in this area, and then I'm going to pull this down, snap it into place. Now, one of the tips that I may not have discussed early on, you want to be careful not to overlap your terrain regions. I just overlapped terrain region 1 with terrain region 2. That's going to cause some problems perhaps in the program because one of those is set to a very different elevation while one of them is set to minus 136. So be careful not to overlap your terrain regions. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to shape that. Notice that it's going around the road and then around the house. I'm going to take this lower terrain region, kind of do the same thing. I'm going to pull this up and I put some blue CAD snaps, probably pretty difficult to see on your screen, and all I'm doing is using this as a guideline right in here, and I'm just going to put a few breaks in here so that we can pull this down, pull it into place. We'll zoom in just a little bit. You can see that I have a CAD point right in this area right here, and then I'm just going to snap it into place, and that should be pretty close to what I need. Let's go back into the 3D view and take a look. As we look around here, this looks like a pretty harsh area where that terrain wall is. I probably need to come in here. Let's zoom in. Let's click on that terrain region, and I'm going to put one more break in here, and we'll just kind of pull this down just a little bit so that it snaps onto another point, and hopefully that's going to clean that up. Again, we're very close right in that region. That's where we're looking at in here, and that's why we're creating that big elevation drop. So let's see what we have in here. Also pull this back over so that it's not sloping clear past that other area. And then one more change in this area. Let's go ahead and pull this back. I'm going to put a break right in this area. Again, I don't want any overlapping points. That looks better. Let's rebuild our terrain. That looks pretty smooth in the 2D view, and in the 3D view you can see that we've smoothed that terrain out, and that looks pretty close to what we need on the back of the house. Since I have a retaining wall in the sample plan, I just want to briefly show you the difference between a retaining wall and a terrain wall. Underneath your terrain wall tools, the first one is a straight terrain wall. As I click and drag, this is going to follow the slope just as if it were a fence. A retaining wall, as I kind of mouse over this, you can see the description. This is going to break the terrain. You can notice in the topography down here, the terrain is being retained, and it will actually break and make an adjustment in there to your terrain so it will hold it back, just like an elevation region that would be squished up against there, and a drastic change to adjust that down. That's the way a retaining wall works. One of the frequent questions that comes up is in your floor plan view, if you want to use sea-level terrain. We are using a relative terrain where the top of the grade is at 0, and then all of the numbers are just whole numbers based on that 0 level terrain. And if you want to create a sea-level terrain, in this case the finished grade up here should be 3820. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open up the terrain perimeter, and I'm going to come into where our subfloor height is, and I'm going to say plus 3820 in feet. Let's just go ahead and copy that number because I'm going to have to use this 2 more times. Plus 3820 feet. And then I'm going to do the exact same operation on the terrain regions we created plus 3820. That will resolve in inches, and then we'll just do the same thing. Plus 3820, rebuild the terrain, and now you can see those are now displaying in sea level numbers. And back in the 3D view, you can see that there is actually no change at all because we made the changes in all of the elevation information. If you plan to use sea level elevation information, do that at the beginning when you create your terrain perimeter, and then all subsequent elevation data will use that as the basis. Using the elevation camera, I'll generate the side elevation. In this elevation view, I want to switch the layer set so I can superimpose and turn on the terrain. I'm going to come over and I'm going to turn on my active layer display set, and I've built a specific layer set that has the terrain already turned on. In this vector style view, you'll be able to see the terrain layer that's on. What I like to do is transition the camera filter to the glasshouse view, and then I like to draw a CAD line that will represent the terrain. Using the CAD line tool, I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to draw a line approximately over the top of the terrain, and then I'm going to go ahead and switch the layer set back so that it does not have the terrain view on. Once we've done that, I'll switch the camera back to the vector style view, and now you can see this terrain line. And a lot of times what you can do is maybe change that line style. Right now it's a solid line. Here's what I might do. I might make it a dashed line, and then you can do the appropriate call out on that terrain so that it will specifically what that is. We have a story pole dimension tool. If we were to run the story pole dimension, you could come in here and add a marker to that. If I show you the finished view that I've created, here's the way I've used the annotation to call out not only the dimensions, but you can see in my text where the terrain is at the subfloor level in the front, and then as you can see it transition and slope, and I did that by toggling on the layer for the terrain and just using the CAD line and tracing over the top of it. Here's a view of the finished site plan that I've created for this project. You can see that it excludes all of the terrain modifiers that have been used to slope and generate the terrain around the house. Let me show you how I've done this by changing my Save Plan view and layer set. From my floor plan view in my menu, I have a drop down for the Save Plan views. I have a specific Save Plan view for the site plan. You can also access the Save Plan views from your project browser, which I have open on the right hand side of my screen. And if you wanted to open that up simultaneously, I'll just double click on the site plan. You can see when this view opens up, all of the terrain modifiers, the terrain elevation regions, have been turned off in the layer set that I'm specifically using called Plot Plan for this Save Plan view. If I tile my screens up here, let's go ahead and tile our screens. The view on the left is the site plan, and the view in the center is the terrain modifiers. I like to create a Save Plan view that has a terrain modifier such as this terrain elevation region, but on the site plan I like to make sure that layer is turned off, and then when I send that out to my construction drawings through the layout page, it's a very clean view of the site plan. For those of you that may do landscaping plans as I have on my screen, you will find over 4,000 plants, tools for stepping stones, and all the tools to create swimming pools and fencing. For this project, I have created all of the landscaping elements and then blocked and saved them into my library. As I switch my saved plan view to the specific landscaping view that I've created and the layer set, I'll place the landscaping architectural block. I'll rotate it 180 degrees. Then, using the point-to-point move tool found in the lower edit menu, I'm going to position it into place. Now, I've quickly added all of the landscaping items for this project. And as I move back over and look at this in 3D, you can see all of those elements added with the landscaping that really can help the client see what their brand new project is going to look like. I hope you enjoyed this session on terrain and site plans. I would encourage you to try out the landscaping tools for yourself. If you'd like to download this Bachelor View sample plan, you can replay this session and repeat the same steps, or you can use your own plan. If you're not already a customer, you can download a free trial version of our software. Enjoy and have fun using Chief Architect software. So we're going to take your live questions. A lot of that went pretty quickly, and so if you want to ask your questions related to terrain and site plans, we'll take those.
All right, let's check in with Corey Sandwick. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
It's Corey Sandwick from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I sometimes get site or surveys from surveyors that are in AutoCAD that I can import into Chief Architect. Can you kind of, is there an advantage of being able to do that, or I don't know, even how do you do that well?
Yeah, that's a common question, Corey. And one of the things that, if I kind of open up an example here and we slide down, this is just an image. And the last thing I want to do is kind of trace over this image of all the contours. So if I can get the DWG file, because there's a bit of work in tracing out all of these lines, right? And I would always try to get that DWG file. And one of the things that we've done is we've created a specific video for how to import one of those DWG files on the website. And if you just do a survey DWG import search on the website, you'll find that video. And it looks like this is about 11 minutes, and it walks through the typical examples. And the key there is getting your contour data layer and your terrain elevation set, as well as your terrain perimeter. And then it will come in and you can be able to generate it in 3D. Is this the type of file that you would be importing, something that looks like this?
Yeah, that is that is similar. Yeah, something with a lot of information on it. And I do have, typically what's topography versus the property line as well.
Yeah, I have this surveyor file here, and it's only a PDF right now, and I've kind of avoided tracing over it because I'm a little bit lazy, and I'm waiting for the DWG file to come back for the file, because I just don't want to spend the time in tracing over it if I can avoid it.
Thank you.
Yep, so take a look at that video. Thanks a lot for calling in. Carrie?
Yep, Corey, I chatted out the link to that video for you. Our next question comes from Lionel again. Let's check back in. Go ahead, Lionel.
Yeah, hello. I'm Lionel. I'm from Sierra Leone.
Okay.
I have a question. Normally, we have coordinates in northings and eastings. I've tried to enter the coordinates in Chief Architect. It's very difficult for me to do. I don't know if there is a provision there for northings and eastings, not normal coordinate. That we have a coordinate system here, and we use northings and eastings.
Are you saying northerns and easterns? Is that I understand?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things you can do, Lionel, is we kind of zoom out here and we look at the information here. You can see that I don't have much information in here, but I have a northern 90 west, and I actually don't have a north pointer in here. First thing is, when you want to enter your coordinates in with bearing information, underneath your default settings, underneath your CAD, there's a general CAD setting, and you can change this to quadrant bearing. There's also azimuth bearing information as well as some others. Do you see that okay?
It's all quadrant bearing. Okay.
Do you see that okay?
Yes, I see. I'll see later. I'll try to test them later.
Right. So then when you have that set up, and if randomly just put a north pointer in here. I come down underneath my CAD tools and I draw a north pointer. Watch what happens when I draw the north pointer and then I rotate it around. You can see this bearing information updates, right? And that's because I've set that up to be the quadrant bearing in my CAD.
Okay, but the coordinates I'm talking about is I think it's in degrees and in minutes.
Sure.
Like this,
So
yes,
here,
like this one.
okay. So here's
Like
an
that.
example. If
Yeah.
we take a look at this plot, right? Here's the bigger plot of the neighborhood, and I kind of picked on this lot 46 here, and I cropped it out down below, and you can see the coordinates are north 89, 58 minutes, 40 seconds. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So if I want to replicate that, and we look back where the north pointer really is in here, this is facing north this direction. And typically I'm going to rotate my lot so that I can figure out and draw my walls parallel with one of the lot lines. So if I rotate this up so that it's parallel, and let's assume I'd want to have my wall parallel to this one, and we look at what that coordinate should be, and I wrote it down, north 89, 58, 40. I'm just going to copy that value. So I'm going to copy it. And then I'm going to take this north pointer, and let's go into the north pointer, and let's check our number style because I want to make sure that I'm quadrant bearing. So that will just display this in the dialog box to be quadrant bearing. So I clicked on the number style to just display the value of the angle to be quadrant bearing. Then you can type it in, or in my case, I'm going to go ahead and just paste it in there. Okay.
Okay.
Then when you look at this, you can see north is now going the correct way. And when you zoom in, you see the details of that line have updated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but what is the west doing there? Because the one I have here is just like longitude and latitude.
Yeah,
And
well,
longitude.
you'll notice one is west and one is east. And basically the way this line is drawn, one's going up and down, one's going down the opposite way. And so that's why it's showing east and west. I could flip those lines, but one's always going to say east and one's always going to be west. If you want to just overwrite that and put the east marker over in there, you'll have to overwrite it.
Yeah, let me just clarify. I'm not talking about lines. I'm talking about points. I normally take coordinates with my GPS, and the information they gave me is in longitude and latitude, like 8 degrees 29 minutes.
Okay. Well, when you're drawing out a line, okay,
it's points. It's not lines. It's points. Different points. I'm talking about different points.
So if you put in a point, let's see if we can go in and set this up. You see where I can go in and put the point right in here?
Yeah.
Well, then once I put the number of points that I want, then I can connect the lines and close the lot.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. So just change your number style down here to be sure that it's in quadrant bearing information. And that way you'll be able to input that data. And I think we may have a video on this or a help article. If we do, it'd probably be an article. If we do, we'll text or chat that out. Okay?
Okay. All right. Okay.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot for your call today, Lionel.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Thank you for your help.
Okay.
Scott, we have several people writing in and they were curious, what level do you normally put the retaining walls on?
Well, when you're doing your retaining walls, you want to always put that on the same level as your terrain perimeter. because those retaining walls are going to break the terrain, and it's important that they go on the level that you've created the terrain perimeter. Doesn't matter what level you create the terrain perimeter. I usually try to put it on the most relevant floor, and when you've made the decision which floor it is, then you put that terrain, any of your terrain modifiers, walls or elevation data, should always go on your terrain perimeter. I'll just open that up just to kind of, force the conversation. Let me pull that up. So in this case, I've got a simple house, right? And I've got a retaining wall, and I've got my elevation region. The terrain perimeter happens to be on floor 1, but all of these terrain elements are on the same floor. So when you take a look at this, you can see all of these elements are on this particular level, and you can see how the terrain then gets generated. So be sure to put all those on the same level you put your terrain perimeter, and they actually have to be encapsulated inside of your terrain perimeter.
All right, thank you, Scott. Our next question is from Tina Clay. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I just missed the part where you were talking about how you set your sea level on the terrain information, if it's like just a click of a button.
So yeah, good question. Thanks, Tina. When you're doing your sea level information, what you want to do is you want to open up your terrain perimeter. Right now, this is using, if I zoom in a little bit, you can see that this is zero base, so it's not showing sea level information. And I have a line and an elevation region and a terrain perimeter. So I would need to change all 3 of those items. And if we open up the terrain perimeter right now, what I'd want to do is adjust this. So right now it's using a subfloor height that it's been using automatic. If I just say plus 2,000 feet, and I'm going to copy that, plus 2,000 feet, and then we go into the other elements and say plus 2,000 feet, and then take this one and this elevation region plus 2,000 feet. I think those are the only ones that I had in there. And then we regenerate the terrain. And I probably missed one in here. So that then generates the elevation data to have the sea level information. And I probably missed one in there, but that's kind of how you do that. Does that make sense? And I covered that in the video of the process of doing that.
Yeah, I thought maybe there was I missed it where you can just click a button and automatically generates.
Yeah, I try to do it when I'm going to actually build the terrain, because then all of the other terrain elements that are coming in will come in relative to that, so I don't have to change them after the fact.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for the call, Tina.
Yeah, so how to draw out or depict the drainage lines on the site plan? Because on the site plan, you depict the septic system. So how does one draw those pipes out to include what goes underneath the foundation?
Right. If I switch back, let's go back into the site plan here, and I'll show you what I typically do. So if I zoom in here, I've got these locations for the water, sewer, power, gas, and cable in here. I don't typically draw those in 3D. I just show it in CAD where they're located, and then I'll maybe dimension to them if it's important, if there's a location in the street. But I don't typically show those in 3D. You could do a molding polyline if that was important to you, and then set the elevation of it. Does that?
And I'm sorry, I missed that. How would I show a pipe?
Do you actually want to see it in 3D?
I would, yes.
Yeah, so what I would do is I would take one of these lines and I would convert it to what's called a molding polyline. So I've selected the line for the water here, right? Yeah. And then there is a convert button in my lower edit menu, and it says convert to polyline. I'll pause there. Do you see it okay?
I do, yes, thank you.
It was Alex, right?
Yes.
Okay. A little confused because I think somebody was asking that question a different way. Okay, so when you convert that, one of the options is to convert this as a molding polyline, right?
Yep.
And probably what I need to do, since this is going to be turning in a couple of different directions, I probably want to do a 3D version of this so that I can then take an elevation view and probably bend it to follow the terrain if that's going to happen in any way. And then once I convert it, let's go ahead and turn that layer on. And then for the moldings, I'm actually going to, it's using a square one. Let's just replace that with, well, we'll use a square one to save time, but I'm going to make it pretty big. Let's make it 30 inches just so we can see this, okay? I know you don't have a 30-inch water line coming in here. Let's maybe, but so now I'm going to have to set the elevation of it, and then I also probably want to figure out what the layer is so it's on moldings, okay? So you see it in the plan view, and then if we take an elevation view, let's cut an elevation through here, just so we can get to the molding part. And we'll turn that layer on. It was on moldings. And you can see this great big thick molding that we have. Maybe we'll resize that now that we know where it is. And let's resize it to just maybe 5 inches. I still want to have it big enough that we can see it. So now I've got this 5-inch pipe coming in here, right? And if you want to have this coming in, I'm going to put a little break there, pull it down, and maybe extend it in so it's going to come into the house in maybe that fashion. Is that what you're after?
Perfect. Yes. And then, yeah, I'll just go back into the options and make it a circle. Got it.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's just called a molding polyline. And in this case, I used a 3D molding polyline so that I can shape it and then pull it in and you know, have it follow the contour if that's something that's going to happen.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for checking in, Alex.
All right, Scott, our next question is from Mark. Hi, Mark, go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, hi. I'm Mark Thompson calling from Baltimore, Maryland.
Okay, hey, Mark.
How are you doing today?
Good, good.
I have a model that I imported a site plan, you know, drain perimeter and contours, you know, on my main first floor level. The house came in fine, you know, interacting with grade, but in the renovation design, I needed to add an exterior stairwell. And, you know, so obviously that was at the basement level. And when I try to add it, I have a real hard time getting grade to cut square and tight to that, you know, to the basement retaining wall coming out. So I'm just curious, what is the best approach to try to get, you know, this square opening cut into grade right adjacent to the house for the stairwell?
Yeah, there's a setting in the terrain that says cut out for the house, but since you're talking about an area that's just outside the house.
Yes,
then...
and since I'm adding to the footprint that was in place when I originally you know, brought the site in,
sure.
I can't find anywhere to adjust the house footprint relative to the terrain.
Yeah, a lot of times I saw a bunch of questions come in. How do I show the difference between the original lot and then the lot that will be modified to grade for the construction? And it's always important that you don't have terrain lines that compete with one another. So if you start doing some modifications to it, you have to trim out the original lines. And so there's a few different ways to approach it. Let's just take a look in here. Let me see, let me just close a couple of these views that I have open so we can take a look at how we might do that. And we'll get a little simpler variation of this. Boy, I got a lot of stuff open here. Okay. So let's take a look at this pretty simple house in here. And if we want to adjust this terrain, let's pull this back a little bit and regenerate the terrain. There we go. Actually, I want a little simpler one. There we go. So here's just a basic terrain. And if we put in, let me switch over. Let's put in a couple of walls in here that would represent where the house is. Okay, and then we'll slope this lot just slightly. So let's go in and we'll build a slope. So I'm going to use the elevation region, and we'll come in here and we'll set that to, that should come in at 0, and then we'll do one more of those. And then we'll set this to, let's say, minus 12 feet. And then when we build the terrain, we should have some contours that are pretty tight in here. Yep. Yep. Let's take a peek here, what we have. And I have not much slope. Let's make that a little bit bigger.
I think you did 12 inches instead of 12 feet.
Okay. And I still have a bunch of stuff open. Yeah, you're right, 12 feet. All right, so we have a bunch of sloping in here. And when I want to do the an area that we can pull out, there's a couple ways you could do it. I could use a retaining wall that will break the terrain. Sometimes I don't necessarily get the desired results. I could also come in with a flat region in here, a terrain region, and use that, right? So if I use the terrain region tool and I put in another elevation data point, just right in here, right? And we set that to the same dimension, minus 12 feet, hopefully, minus 12 feet, right? And then I rebuild the terrain so we can see this in the 3D view. And then I can actually trace over that with a concrete wall or whatever that I want to set that up with. Let's see, that's not the right one we want. Got a lot of stuff open apparently. Well, that's not showing that well, but what that did is that pulled that in, and then if I wanted to shape that in any other way, I could shape it just using that terrain contour. It depends on how you want the lines coming in. If it gets real steep, you can also use the the elevation lines. If we said this, and be important that I wouldn't cross this line into the other one like that, but if I said this line is minus 11 feet, right? And then we'll make one more copy of that and we'll pull that up and over just a little bit. And then we'll say this one's minus 10 feet. Generate the terrain. Then you should see that starts to get pretty close in here, but I have a nice square pad in there. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. The issue that I faced was that the adjacent contours wanted to interact with that area, and I wanted to blend in, and I tried was it terrain break, and again learning all the terrain tools, I got some unusual results. So
yeah, you could use a terrain wall, but you will get unpredictable results sometimes because it's trying to guess what you want to do. If you want to be very exact, I usually just draw it in with the terrain elevation data.
Okay.
And then I'll trace over this area to have a specific line.
Okay.
Does that work for you?
I think so. I didn't see the 3D view though to see the
result. Oh yeah, I probably don't have the best 3D view. I didn't put a foundation in or anything.
Okay, yeah, but I can. Okay, I can see the impact of those lines though. On
yeah, it's not the best view, so I apologize about that.
Okay.
probably easier to visualize this in the 2D view to see what's happening with it. And then again, I will typically try to draw in those things. I had a file open earlier where I was kind of shaping some stuff around that may be slightly similar. This one's kind of already put into place. Let's see here. Where's my 3D camera view? So this one kind of has a few, shapes already put in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And so I've forced where this landing is going to come in by using a terrain region. If I go back into that area right in here, I've got a terrain region in there and I've set the elevation of it specifically.
Gotcha. I did not try using terrain region, so that sounds like the magic formula there.
It can be helpful if I just take this wall and I turn off the layers. Sometimes it's nice because then you can see where the contours actually are. It's probably really tough to see on your screen, but you can actually zoom in and see where those contours are. And that way you can kind of figure out if that's working for you. I try to avoid using the terrain wall or the retaining wall and relying on it because it can follow the slope. If I go back in here, and I zoom out a little bit, you can see how it's kind of following that slope. And I like to kind of draw those myself. You can take an elevation view and square it up, but I like to do that just myself and use the terrain regions.
Okay.
And then I can see where the contours are exactly. Then I'll draw my wall and I can dimension it. And then I know that those walls will not be interacting with the terrain itself.
Perfect. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Scott. We had Curtis write in. He was asking if you could demonstrate how to put a landscape block retaining wall that's holding back sloping terrain.
Okay, so let me go back in here. So a terrain wall that's holding back sloping terrain, maybe similar to what we have here.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, so the way that works when you are in the terrain itself, and let's go ahead and turn those foundation walls back on that we were just working with. So you can see these. So this is considered a retaining wall. And as I've moved my toolbar over to the terrain configuration, that tool is right here. It's called terrain wall. And you can see that there is a straight retaining terrain wall, which will follow the slope. And then the other one is a retaining wall, which will retain and break the terrain. So when you use this and we break the terrain, I'll just draw another, let's make sure I use the right tool here. And I use this retaining wall and we break the terrain in here and we regenerate the terrain. You can see that it's going to cause some break in there, and then you can move this around. If I move this back up and even maybe step on top of it with the other one, regenerate, you can see the way that would then update the terrain as we kind of slide over to the other side and take a look at the way that's both retaining and breaking the terrain for that. And that's the best way to do it. And you want to paint it. I think you mentioned block. You could then, I've got this other wall over here with brick. You can use that and apply that material on there using the material painter.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Our next question is from Linda. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Linda.
Hi there. I'm from Ohio. My
Okay.
question is somewhat twofold, and I do appreciate these webinars. When I watched the video, I got the impression that you should use the elevation line in conjunction with the regions.
Mm-hmm.
From your video, I'm getting the impression that just maybe using one would be the best, because and I'm going to go ahead and ask my second part too. And then
Okay.
when I've done that, and when I've gotten them close together,
Mm-hmm.
I go into my 3D view and it creates multiple spikes. In the
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So What am I doing wrong?
Those are the dreaded shark fins that we refer to. Let me close a couple things here. So if I go into a sloping plan here, I'm going to delete my walls. So I've got a terrain perimeter, and when you get scenarios, this upper one I think we set to 0 feet, and then this one's minus 12 feet. If these get very close together, you should get a pretty tight contour in here, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, if those overlap in any way, or you draw an elevation line that may overlap, if I take an elevation line and I just drag this all the way through here and I set this to, let's say, well, minus 6 feet, and we regenerate the terrain, I'm not sure what's going to happen because this is competing. And sometimes if you have retaining walls that cross, let's generate that terrain and see what happens. It didn't actually have much of an impact. But when you have retaining walls and you have other data that overlaps in any way, you can get some pretty crazy results. So I usually start to zoom in and take a look at where these things may overlap to try to avoid getting those things to create those bubbles around your, or those fins or those shark teeth around your terrain.
Scott, are you able to give me a better understanding of the difference, the different function of the region? See that's what I get so often, and I cannot make it gradual. I have a very difficult time making that gradual slope.
Linda, I'm having a pretty difficult time hearing you. Maybe you could repeat that one more time.
What you're showing on your screen right now is what I get often. How can I avoid that sharp draw and make it more?
Yeah, so I've moved this region very close, right?
Right.
And if I pull this back and regenerate the terrain, it's going to be much smoother, right?
And then, Scott, are you able to help me understand better the difference in function between an elevation region and an elevation line?
Sure, let's take a look at that. The difference between an elevation region and an elevation line. I'm going to delete the elevation region. And in this case, what this is doing, if I zoom in, the last point here is minus 12 feet. And at the very end here, it's also going to be minus 12 feet. So this makes it flat all the way across in this area. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I delete this and I use an elevation line and I come in here, and let's also set that to minus 12 feet. And let's regenerate the terrain and see if there is any difference. Sometimes there isn't, sometimes there is. So let's look at this in 3D. So you see what's happened here is it projects that that's going to continue going down.
Wow. Okay.
Does that make sense? Maybe that's the way the lot is sloping, but the difference is this is only one line. Now I could create a copy of this line and maybe pull it down. Let's just grab that line and create a copy of it and pull it down. So make sure it's still at minus 12 feet, regenerate the terrain. It's probably pretty close to a terrain region in this case. So it's now flat all the way across that bottom for the most part.
Okay.
And I just find it easier if I know that I've got a flat spot. Let's say you're going to put a pool in or a landing pad somewhere. I like to use the terrain elevation region because that means inside of that region, it will be consistent with all of that elevation data. And one of the settings in there is the interior is flat. And that's typically the default.
So basically, when I get the shark fins, I've just put my lines and the regions too close together.
Most of the time. I wouldn't say all the time, because sometimes there are little gremlins in terrain things when you have terrain walls or retaining walls, and it does take a little bit of looking into. I oftentimes will turn off the layers for those walls so I can see exactly where some of those issues get generated.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot for calling in, Linda.
All right, let's check in with Charles. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi there, this is Chuck from Portland, Oregon. I have a question about subfloor height above terrain.
Yeah.
For a rectangular home or a simple shape with a simple subfloor or floor plan, it's pretty easy to determine where the center of gravity is, if you will. And I think that's what's used for setting subfloor height above terrain. What if you have a pretty complex terrain and a pretty complex floor plan where there's alcoves and all sorts of interesting things in the shape? How do you get the program to show you what XY point on the floor plan is actually being used for setting the subfloor height above the terrain? I hope my question makes sense.
Sure. Well, thanks for calling in, Chuck. That's a good question. I mean, you can look at, let me just grab a plan here. When you look at the subfloor setting, so here's a house with a bunch of, alcoves that are coming in and out of it. And the subfloor setting, when you click on one of these rooms and you look at it, whatever it is, living room, and you look at the floor structure, floor 0 is going to be at absolute 0, and that's where your subfloor is. And so that's where the terrain is based. It's not a function of all the little alcoves that go around here. So that's where that subfloor setting comes into your terrain. And if we look at this one in 3D, give it a second here. Well, let's make sure we turn on the landscape.
Yeah, that's the easy part. It's for the complex terrain where the crawl space is on a slope and things are uneven. How do you figure out what point underneath the floor plan, the XY point, where the program is using above the terrain for setting the subfloor height?
So usually I just start in a simple 2D view. And if you come into the site plan and you look at, where is your residence going to be located, right? And in this case, I've got it set to be 2320 and some change. Same for the garage. And then you look at where your terrain elevation contours are coming in, then you can set your elevation data for your house, and then you need to start sloping it because you're going to be modifying that terrain and adjusting it. But I usually type in all my values in 2D and make sure these lines match up. So you can see the contour lines are stepping down the side of the house, right? And so I just kind of focus to make sure that it all matches with what I'm seeing in the, the surveyor information, and then how I'm going to take this terrain perimeter. And if we take this terrain perimeter, if I can grab it, let's see what we've got it set at. So then I'll just set my subfloor height. Let's change our number style to be decimal feet. So you can see where that, is set to be where the subfloor height is at the terrain level. And that's how I typically would do it.
Okay, what would be really cool is if there were like a little CAD dot somewhere showing where exactly within the floor plan the subfloor height above terrain is being used.
Okay, well in that case, I've got this set up, right in here. You could put your own CAD point in there and draw out a text indicator and put that in there.
Okay, I was looking for something that the program would show me about the point, XY point that it's using for setting my subfloor height? What point within the sloping irregular terrain is it using to set my subfloor height?
And that would be just this number right here.
Okay.
That's where that comes in.
Yeah. Okay. I still don't know what the XY point is for an irregular sloping odd terrain where it's actually using that to set my subfloor height. I guess the answer is just fiddle around until you get the result you want.
Well, if you want to send in an example, I just don't fully understand what you're after.
I get it. Yeah.
So maybe you know, send us in an example. Let's take a look at it, and we'll see if we can get you a better answer that's more relevant to you.
Will do. Hey, thanks for trying.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Are you ready for a few more questions, Scott?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's check in with Brandon, which would be our last question. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, Brandon.
Okay, so basically, you know, if this is a flat terrain, just forget all the slopes because it's the same answer. But if it's a flat terrain, I'm going to make a building. I put a foundation to it, but I'm going to punch a little cantilever out on the first floor. Like you see a lot of these fireplaces that are punched out, but that don't have a foundation to them.
Sure. So you want to figure out.
Yeah, how can I like force the terrain to fill in that thing without unchecking the hide terrain checkbox and then having it, because like there's no way to view it from the inside and the outside at the same time. If you've got, you know, if you uncheck that, it throws it through the whole basement space.
Okay. Let's see if we can get a solution for you. Let me close a few of these things here. It'll be easier just to close the entire thing.
I mean, certainly a way is like I could just draw the terrain as a, you know, a polyline shape or something, but
sure. There's always several ways you can solve.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a cheat.
So let's see if we can pull one up.
I mean, literally, you could draw a square.
Okay, so here's a little pop out, right?
Yep.
And if we create our terrain perimeter, let's go back into our site plan and generate our terrain perimeter. Okay. Let's take a look at what we have. Okay, so you've got a hole there and you want to cover it up. Is that your answer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering if there's, again, I know that there's ways I can cheat it. I'm wondering, is there a way that just, is there a setting that says terrain under this area, or, you know, like this is one of those pieces that has propagated for 20 generations.
Right. If I zoom in a little bit, you don't see any terrain in the basement, right?
Yeah.
And that's because in the terrain perimeter, I think it's marked to say
right at the bottom of the page.
Yeah. Hide intersecting terrain. But in this case, I've got this little cantilever, right?
Yep.
And I want to have it covered up.
Exactly.
So what do? Well, let's take a look at one of the options. You can actually click on this terrain. It was Brandon, right?
Yep.
You can actually click on this terrain and
I didn't see that it gave me any handles anywhere.
Create a manual hole. So I'm going to click on the terrain. Okay. And then in the very bottom edit menu is this option that says make terrain holes around the building.
Okay.
What that's going to do is that's going to separate out the hole from the terrain.
Oh, so it does give me handles.
Right. So at that point, you can make it bigger, you can make it smaller.
That's what I needed exactly right there. Perfect.
Is that it?
I knew you were going to be the hero.
Well, I got lucky there, huh?
Hey, thanks again. Take care. Happy New Year to you.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks everybody for attending today. Have a great day. We'll be sending out that note with the link to the recording and survey. Take a look at it. Hopefully we'll see you online soon, and have a great day.